I think I have my voice back this week, so less painful for me, and I hope for you too. Last week we were looking at the way in which ordinary language analysis broadened and loosened up the rigid scientific empiricism of the logical positivists. And we were seeing that in particular with reference to the religious language dispute of the 1950s, early 60s, which was groping for some kind of empirical reference to talk about God. I want this morning, a little bit late for that, this afternoon, to take a look at ethical theory since logical positivism. And what we'll see initially is the same sort of influence of ordinary language analysis in breaking that stranglehold of logical positivism with its emotivist theory of ethics. Ayer articulates it very effectively in that chapter of his on ethics and theology, when he argues that there are really no moral judgments that can be made, only emotive expression, not even statements about subjective states of affairs, not even those are judgments, they are simply descriptions of psychological states, not moral judgments. And so to say anything like stealing is wrong or war is shameful is simply emoting and not bringing any predicate to bear on what we're talking about. Now, the influence of the ordinary language analysis comes out in a debate that went on within what we call meta-ethics. Really a term that was coined in conjunction with G.E. Moore's quest for what is the good. And you remember Moore maintained that we have some intuitive knowledge of good and intuitive recognition, rather, of the good, though we cannot reduce it to any natural property. Happiness, pleasure, utility, natural law, or anything at all empirically or metaphysically definable. His naturalistic fallacy. Ayer responded, of course, to Moore's intuitionism by maintaining that if we cannot define or describe the good, the term is meaningless. And so the emotivist theory simply spun out of that sort of consideration. But metaethics has to do with the meaning of ethical language. And you can see obviously how metaethical concerns were the prime concern as a result of logical positivism's claim that moral terminology is meaningless, cognitively meaningless. It refers to nothing. But intuitionism didn't die as a result of that. W.D. Ross continued a kind of intuitionism where what is intuitive is the right, not the good, but the right. And you might keep those two terms distinct with a parallel distinction between Mill and Kant, Mill, and any consequentialist or teleological ethic is concerned with good, the good outcome, the good end that we're pursuing. Whereas the right has to do with the quality of an act or a motive itself, not in terms of consequences. In Kant, the right is always acting out of duty. So W.D. Ross maintained that we have an intuitive recognition of right. The meaning of that term becomes clear even though we cannot reduce it to any other property. Still avoiding the naturalist fallacy, you see. But it's recognizable, for instance, in the case of having entered into contract or made a promise. We then recognize that we have trailing obligations. And it is right that we fulfill our obligations. And so the meaning of the term then has to do, in that context, to commonly recognized obligations arising from certain relationships and contracts. You might notice that what is beginning there has become much more frequent since, a kind of contractarian theme. Having entered into contract, we have obligations. Later on, we'll find that that gets universalized as a basis of all moral obligation, some kind of contractarian relationship. But it's simply a point of reference for Ross in giving examples of our intuitive recognition of the right. But the ordinary language analysis comes into play more effectively when you get to the other developments that I've listed. A moral point of view approach, developed somewhat by William Frankener, taught at University of Michigan, wrote a widely used introduction called simply Ethics, that for a book of about 120 pages has probably been used more than any other one. Still find it referred to. Frankener was Christian Reformed background, Calvin College graduate, and while his theism does not come out explicitly in his book, it's certainly there under the surface, and became evident in an article that he wrote, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, that he wrote in the late 30s, as I recall it was, in response to G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy, where he argued that while you cannot deduce an ought from an is, if you have some additional premise, for instance of a theological sort, then you can deduce an ought from an is. That is to say, whereas A does not logically imply B, A plus B do logically imply B. So with the addition of some premise which can introduce a source of moral obligation, basis for values, you can deduce some moral obligation from certain factual premises. So that if you say, premise B, God, personal moral being exists, then immediately you've got some value judgment into the initial premise. But in any case, that initial paper of his, which actually established his reputation in philosophy, that initial paper of his, I think, prepared the way for his later emphasis on taking a moral point of view. Because the meaning of ethical terms depends on your taking a moral point of view. That is to say, to take a moral point of view represents itself a non-cognitive ingredient, not emotive, simply, but a non-cognitive kind of attitude as you commit yourself to assessing things morally, you see. So with the addition of that non-cognitive point of view, then you begin to see that moral terms refer to such attitudes as are involved in a moral point of view. They have that psychological point of reference. You might say that this leads to a sort of ethical subjectivism, where the moral terminology is defined in relationship to such subjective states as taking a moral point of view. All right, but you still have cognitive moral judgments as a result, which is what you did not have with A.G. Ayer. Kurt Beyer is second representative of this, Australian philosopher. More widely referred to is the prescriptivism of R.M. Hare. R.M. Hare, who taught at Oxford, you remember I mentioned him in connection with the religious language debate. He was the man with the example of the Oxford Don who had an irrational blick, you recall, about someone trying at that time. In his book, The Language of Morals, tried to analyze the ordinary usage, remember that phrase? Tried to analyze the ordinary usage of moral language in common parlance, and came to the conclusion that what pervades moral language is an imperative rather than an indicative form of grammar. So that the root significance is not that you are making some factual statement, A is B, or something of that sort, stealing is wrong, but the imperative mood, don't do it. Moral language is prescribing, not describing. And as such, it evades the positivist verification of purportedly factual descriptions. Moral assertions are not factual descriptions, they're prescriptions. And so you have something different. Notice implicit in that the claim that the logical positivist view of language was so crudely narrowed down, when all it allowed was tautologies and descriptive statements. Everything else is emotive expression. Well, what about commands and so forth? Notice that puzzle even in Wittgenstein, a passage that I read to you last week, where Wittgenstein says, somebody says, thou shalt not. And what you want to say in response is, oh, what if I do? What Wittgenstein is sort of toying with is the oddity of a thou shalt not, if you're working with a reductionist view that all you can do is make factual statements or express things emotively. You see, what is this thou shalt not? And Hare, in effect, is picking up on this and seeing it as the salient feature of moral language, not only moral judgments, but all other kinds of moral language as well. Prescriptivism. That kind of prescriptivism, of course, is quite non-committal about the grounds on which it is based. This may be a social prescription. It may be a parental prescription.